Welcome back to the PetroNerds podcast, everyone. Today is April 1st, 2021, so I'm positive that Ethan is going to have a lot of things that are April Fool's related for me that is going to go over my head. But this is the 9th PetroNerds podcast, and a lot has happened in the oil market, and I'm really excited to be here chatting with Ethan. Unfortunately, we are not together, if you'll notice, so my colleague back here is Axel, and Ethan's sitting at his home with a lovely fireplace behind him. So we will jump right into this. I'm your host, Trisha Curtis, the CEO of PetroNerds. This is my co-host,
Ethan Bellamy. Welcome. And the best thing about not being next to Trisha is she can't smack me, so the jokes will be better today. As she said, it's April Fool's Day 2021, but there's never any joking with my co-host, so you're all safe from a Volkswagen-style parody joke here. Welcome to the PetroNerds podcast. I'm your co-host, Ethan Bellamy. I am across town from Trisha today. She is the CEO of PetroNerds. In today's podcast, we will talk about crude oil prices. Trisha wants to talk about the rig count. We'll talk about oil demand, Aramco, the $400 billion Iran-China cooperation agreement. I think we might address API embracing a carbon tax. The Indian Minister for Power made some crushing comments at an IEA meeting. And we'll, of course, make many digressions as we always do. So, Trisha, let's start with the rig count. You want to talk about rigs?
Yes, I do. So, we'll just briefly touch on it. I think really next week, this week we're kind of going to devote to oil prices, demand, and OPEC and all these things that Ethan mentioned. And next week, I think would like to get into U.S. production a bit more. But we are, and this gets into OPEC, because 241 rigs that Enervis said in the Permian Basin. That's a lot. We've added, we're on a steady ramp to 300. And I think it's important to just take into perspective that we were at 125 rigs in July. That's Permian Basin. That was the bottom, 125 rigs in July. So it's important to think about where we've come from, where we're at, and how we've continued to steadily add those rigs. You and I have talked about it at length in our very first podcast of how those rigs run. And really, if you start looking at who those operators are, there are dozens of companies with 1 and 2 rigs. And I think that's really meaningful, really important to think about, is that we just have a lot of that, especially at these oil price levels. So Permian rig additions are huge. According to Baker Hughes Eagle Ford is now at 33 rigs. That was, think about the bottom of that was like 9 rigs or like 8 rigs over the summer. And we have 337 total oil rigs running in the U.S., according to Baker Hughes. The number's a little higher for Enverus because they include all the workover rigs and everything. But the point is that, and you can comment on this, but 241 rigs in the Permian, it's a lot of rigs, and we're not going to need 400 to go back to the levels we were at, because we always cut off these rigs. So I think when we get toward 300 rigs, we're not completely back where we were from an efficiency standpoint, but we're pretty close.
Well, that's the Permian, though, and the rest of the basin certainly haven't recovered like the Permian. So do you think we have a sufficient rig count to get back to pre-COVID levels?
Well, we're not yet. So the production data is certainly lagging. And I was just looking at Permian Basin production last night, and we're still stuck, right? Our production's lagging. EIA data just put up 11 million barrels per day for the US. Things are looking flat-ish. So the data is lagging, but it's definitely going to pick up. No, we don't have enough rigs in the other basins to grow. I think we're starting to get to the point that we can keep things flattish. And that's, we have kept things flat, and as we're increasing that rig count. But think about it, we're not off 33 rigs. We were at 70 pre-COVID, so we're half of that in the Eagle Ford. And we do have some chunk of that, whether it's 10 rigs or 20 rigs, are no longer needed, right? Because the other rigs are more efficient. So when you think about it like that, 10 rigs, you're not that far off. So we're getting closer to the point at which I wouldn't say growing out and out growing on an absolute number, but we're getting closer to the point where this isn't just some, pie in the sky stuff. And I think 11 million barrels per day, maintaining that's pretty easy. And that should start getting us into the OPEC talk. But I think I'm pretty pleased with the rig count growth. I know Chuck Yates and many others and David Ramsden would say that we never need to add another rig in this country, but obviously we're going to add them, and people are going to continue to add them. And I think we will easily go up to 300 rigs in the Permian.
Okay, well, we have a natural segue here. Let's talk about crude oil prices, which have given back $5 a barrel from a local high of $66 at the beginning of March. WTI today, again, it's April 1st, is 61.45. Brent closed at just shy of $65. So first question, where do you see oil prices for the rest of the year? And secondly, how do you assess the trajectory of the demand recovery?
That's a great question, Ethan. I think so. Last night prices were $59, and and that was amazing because OPEC last night. I had thought actually OPEC last night was probably going to keep things look like they were going to keep things flat given the way they were talking about demand outlooks. So the fact that we saw a buck and a half or a couple buck rise on the and the increased output, it's really positive. I mean, we had really good demand data for the U.S. And the U.S. does seem to be kind of holding the bag here because U.S. Cushing data, inventories were overall good, refinery runs were good, utilization was up a little bit, and demand, oh my gosh, U.S. demand, we're on an absolute number, we're hitting that 20 million barrel a day mark. Now we're still off on gasoline demand, we're still shy about 1 million barrels a day, and we're still off on jet fuel demand, but it's other oils, which does include some jet fuel and some kerosene, like things are looking up from a demand perspective in the US. And so that's holding up prices to a large extent. And I think that the other thing we have to take into account is that we've had, and people seem to be sort of misplacing both supply, like when we talk about demand and when we talk about price, sometimes people are misplacing supply and demand. So if they see prices going up, they assume that's always demand, and if they see prices going down, they assume that's supply. And I think we have to be really careful of thinking about, we've maintained to a large extent, we've had these cuts offline. We're bringing them back on slowly within OPEC. And the demand side, we have brought them slowly back, and we brought these Libyan barrels back on, and the market is telling us, at least right now, that demand looks okay. The US is recovering, Europe's going back into lockdown, and Asia's recovering. And we're seeing that at least for right now, the economic data looks good in China, and we're looking at an 11 to 12 million barrel a day demand market. And, given all the anger that India's having right now over crude oil prices, it seems to be that they're importing plenty of crude oil as well. And that pre-COVID was over 5 million barrel a day market. So I think prices, I'm not nearly as bullish as some. I'm not where Goldman Sachs was on the 80 price. We could certainly see spikes, but the fact that we had the pullback that we did, prices ran up to 70 Brent, 65 WTI, and we pulled that down, kind of showed we needed that. We needed this pullback in the market because it just got a little too hot to handle. And I don't think global demand, the supply and demand picture was there. And OPEC now has to start bringing these barrels back. And this will, as the oil minister of Saudi Arabia said, this will test the market to see how it absorbs those barrels. And so, if we see the fears in Europe probably were a little overdone, and that's probably why the market's still pretty strong, because Europe isn't a huge oil demand, at least it's not a growth market, and it isn't, it's not that big of a market in total because they just don't consume that. So when you see these pockets of shutdowns, yes, it's impacting it for sure. It's meaningful. But I think it has more from the outlook perspective and how people feeling about demand as opposed to the absolute volumes. Do you agree with that, Ethan?
I don't think it's a very easy question to answer. Demand for me is a function of government policy, which is fickle based on the wind. So if we see a good vaccine rollout everywhere, the U.S. is doing very well. I think the most recent stats were something very high, like a third of Americans now have at least one shot, which is very compelling to get us to that herd immunity. Then we'll start to see travel. But you've got a contrast to places like Florida, where basically everything is open, and New York, which wants to have a vaccine passport system, which is about as totalitarian as you can get. And that seems to be one of the strategies of the Europeans as well. So that's going to govern jet fuel demand. And until we purge all this government intervention in the markets, I don't think we're going to see the full pre-COVID demand recovery.
I fully agree. We're not going to see pre-COVID demand recovery. We're nowhere close to that right now. I mean, we are close to that in a lot of respects. Even with these sort of shutdowns, we're close to it. But the problem is we don't have pre-COVID supply. So OPEC has still, despite Libyan barrels, coming back online, and despite, Iran sending another 1 million barrels a day to China and all these barrels, which we'll get into, despite this, and so that actually, when we know that data, and we've talked about it before, but we shouldn't pay lip service to it because, Russia has actually, both Russia and Kazakhstan were given those outs in the last OPEC meeting. So they've been increasing output by a couple 100,000 barrels a day. And so these additional barrels that have been on the market, yes, we went from 65 to 60 and we went from 70 Brent and we're back down. But honestly, it's held up pretty well, especially given these renewed shutdowns that we're seeing in Europe. So the US overall, it's winning. We are a huge oil market. We're talking about 20 million barrel a day product demand market. So it's huge that we're recovering. And that, you already have one vaccine, right?
I do. I got Moderna and I'm about 3 weeks out from the second dose.
Yeah. And I've been looking and I just realized that Colorado is going to open it up for under basically everybody 16 and above is going to be open on April 2nd, which is tomorrow. So that's huge. The fact that if we already have a third and it's going down, I think we're going to see considerable opening up. And we do have, it is interesting because as we talked about on some of the first podcasts, I think that pent up demand, or really that change in demand and how people, so not everybody is back to work, and yet gasoline demand has recovered to a remarkable level, which means that not everyone just drives to work, that they are driving to the grocery store and they are driving to do things and the weather's getting better. And we are going to see them use their time between now and when they have to go back to the office. And yes, I think lots of people are going to go back to the office. Not everyone for sure. Plenty of people at Twitter won't go back to the office, and Silicon Valley people, but there are other people that will go. And in that time between now and whatever is July for a lot of these companies, they're going to be driving and going on vacation and doing all kinds of things.
Well, he doesn't know it yet, but old Street Bomber is going to DJ a party for me once I have very good revenue visibility coming out of this downturn. Maybe a rooftop pool party in Cherry Creek. We'll see. So before we move on to some other topics, let's just round out the discussion of prices. You and I were both on a Clubhouse call that Chuck Yates and Jeff Davies hosted, two titans of the industry. Always listen to, especially Jeff. I think he's one of the smartest guys, and we're all lucky that Twitter is free and he comments on it. They had Zach Lee from ARM Energy, which is a oil and gas marketing company, as well as on some infrastructure, and he's branching out into renewables. He's done very well. He said that in 22, he was looking for potentially very high prices, perhaps even with a 9 handle on them. What do you think about the potential for spiking prices in 22? And are you that constructive further out beyond 21?
Well, as you know, because you were on that call and I was also a speaker and I pushed him a little hard. I thought his price range, it's pretty easy to be right when you have a $12 window on prices. So his ranges were pretty wide. And I liked a lot of what he said. I didn't disagree with it, but I did having a price deck that wide, yeah, we could have, he basically was saying would have high 50s throughout the year. And it looks like we're going to have, he was actually in those scenarios, he was saying that prices were going to cool off. And it makes sense if you're adding those OPEC barrels back, but that would mean that, demand would have to, either demand is going to have to flatline. We're just going to have to come in line because we have been pulling out inventory barrels. So, in the prices are telling us right now that we could maintain high 50s and 60s. So he's not off there, but that $12 range and the ability that spiking, because he didn't really say that next year it was that, right? It was 2023 that he saw the real price spike, or end of 2022, 2023. And yeah, a lot of people are talking about, Amrita Sen was on, with Energy Aspects, was on Bloomberg last night about midnight. And she's, they were asking her about OPEC countries and prices as well. And they're bullish on prices and all the Goldman Sachs, JP Morgan, all these companies are extremely bullish on prices, and they see this big price spike. They've already been wrong in the near term. So they didn't see, we saw the sort of 65 and pullback. And I think the stuff on India that we're going to get into is really telling of they can't have those prices. And actually what apparently we recently told the Saudis, that prices, it's important to have lower prices, is relevant as well. So I think that OPEC was not only getting pressure internally because people were going to cheat, but they're getting it externally as well. And so when you have enough noise like that, if it's coming from the US, your major big demand centers and big demand growth centers, I'm not sure people realize and appreciate how important stable, low and stable oil prices are for stable demand, not just recovery, but demand growth. And that's something really, really important that OPEC has to understand. So the best thing that could happen to the oil market in terms of a long-term lasting recovery is that prices stay around in the high 50s or low 60s.
Yeah, I don't see us getting into this sort of quote unquote super cycle type environment unless and until the Saudis are producing consistently another 3 million barrels a day. And in the Aramco results, which came out on March 21st, they said that they reached two all-time high peaks in 2020. One was 12.1 million barrels per day in April, and the other was 10.2 BCF a day of gas in August. So with that, I want to jump into some questions from our friend Mark Rossano of C6 Capital Holdings, who is probably the most prolific general economic commentator that doesn't have as much of a viewership as he should. Very smart guy. He's one of my Twitter friends that I've made on the internet in 2020. I'm very happy for it. So he has a few questions. The first was for you regarding OPEC strategy, OPEC Plus strategy heading into summer demand.
These are Mark's questions directly to me.
These are Mark's questions for you. What was the meeting bullish in your view? And then I'm going to give you the other two, and we'll come back to the first one. So the second one is OPEC overestimating or underestimating global demand, and they were up, then they were down. And then the third was, did the Saudis face pressure to start increasing from within OPEC, within Saudi, or from important customers? So to get back to OPEC's strategy heading into the summer, was that meeting bullish?
So no, I don't. I think this meeting was, it's relatively muted, but I don't think it was bullish. And the reason I say that is because their hand was a bit forced. I think that, and they made so much nuances. So I literally had just put this together last night, but on March 11th, OPEC had said, literally the Wall Street Journal headline was fiscal stimulus, vaccine rollouts, brighten OPEC oil outlook demand forecast. That was OPEC demand they literally increased their forecast on March 11th. By March 30th, the OPEC demand outlook down. So they had actually revised their demand outlook down. It was only down a smidgen, but it was in the near term. Now, to me, that was the Saudis, and I still think I'm right here, but that was the Saudis hoping, because the OPEC Plus revised down their demand forecast at the request of the Saudis. So that was the Saudis saying, hey, we looked at the demand forecast, and even though less than 2 weeks ago we thought that it was better, it's not so good, so let's revise it down. That to me was what they wanted to use to get everyone to sort of maintain the cuts. And I think what they realized was that you can't give Kazakhstan and Russia the outs that they gave them last month. And we have to keep in mind that this is a really unprecedented, unique management thing. And it's a double-edged sword, because you are doing this monthly, which means you can micromanage it, but you're also expected, if you have dramatic changes monthly, that's going to be problematic. So the fact that they came out now, and they not only are the Saudis are slowly bringing their barrels back from the 1 million barrel day cut, but they're allowing another 1 million barrels a day. If you've read a couple articles already, the math doesn't quite add up. It's 2 million barrels a day. It's 2 million barrels a day plus. It's 350,000 barrels a day 1 month, 450. It's going to be a little messy. And I think the reason it doesn't read bullish to me is that I think that cheating, and they were concerned about cheating. And I think people have to really realize that if you look at if you saw the information on Saudi Aramco and you look at the Saudi, but how well improved the Saudi outlook looks, how these Middle Eastern countries, their fiscal outlook so much better at these, just even a couple months of these price levels have really helped them just get back to breathing room, to where they can borrow, they're just in a much better situation. So the risk for OPEC Plus, and particularly the Saudis, is that this is really profitable to cheat. It's super, super profitable to eke out another 100,000 barrels a day. And you can actually see it in OPEC's numbers when you see what the revenue they were making when they were producing over 12 million barrels a day, and they were bringing in like 6 billion. And now they're producing a fraction of that, and yet they're bringing in twice the revenue. So that's the same math works for all these countries. So when they start eking, adding these barrels back, and that's why it's going to be problematic for, the market, for OPEC Plus and particularly the Saudis to manage this and just say, okay, we're going to bring all these barrels, we're going to slowly bring them back. And I think it just makes me a little bit, that's why I'm more cautious about these price forecasts that these, Goldman and that, Zach and all these guys were saying, was that, yeah, you can have these price spikes, but we're seeing right now that they're kind of trader driven. These moves, they don't necessarily rely on fundamentals, and something has to underpin a $90 price spike, an $80 price spike. You have to have maintained demand, and we have to be looking and saying we don't have enough supply. And I think that supply, as we're seeing with the rig count coming up in the US, I mean, everybody says we're not going to have enough investment, and that may be true in a few years, but I just don't necessarily see, like, as you add these rigs back, as you're doing this, companies are going to start doing. Oh, and by the way, if you probably saw that, but Saudi Aramco they increased their upstream investment. So it's not like Aramco is reducing their spending. So it's not like they're not going to have the ability to increase their output. So it just, with that much crude sitting in the Middle East, just waiting to come online, it's hard for me to see how we're going to see a big price spike and the super cycle. And I want to get to Mark's question, but I think that super cycle thing is really important, because already, now that prices are cooled a little bit, you're already hearing commentary in the market that it's going to help curb inflation concerns, especially in places like India and even places like the US. So I think that's just an important thing to think about, is that, what it means to have a stable $60 oil price.
Okay. And for context, for our listeners and viewers, Aramco said it was going to spend $35 billion in 2021 on CapEx. That was down from a prior estimate of $40 to $45 billion, but up from $27 billion in 2020 and versus $33 billion in 2019. So to move on to Mark's next question for us, is OPEC overestimating or underestimating global demand?
If you're looking at technically what they say, so they'll come out with their monthly outlook next month, and they're they stay roughly in line with the International Energy Agency. So I don't think they're honestly doing the best that they can do. I don't think they're overestimating. They're micromanaging on a monthly basis. So I don't think they're necessarily overestimating, underestimating. I think their hand is being forced that if they don't bring barrels back to the market, they're going to come back on their own anyway. So they're trying to control this to the best of their capabilities and bring the barrels back on slowly. So I wouldn't necessarily read into what OPEC does as a sign of, directly correlating to that, to this is what demand looks like. Because like I said, they're having their hands forced, and we have to be careful. We have to be very careful of separating what we think about supply and how that directly correlates to demand, because they're not always going to be together. And who knew that Europe was going to have a terrible vaccine rollout? I mean, this was a Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine, for Pete's sake. This was a European American vaccine that was developed, and yet their rollout has been really, really poor. And the Germans just, restrained the use of the AstraZeneca vaccine for folks under the age of 60. So, I mean, this wasn't necessarily expected. I wasn't necessarily expected that we would have as big of an uptake in the US that quickly. But at the same time, I don't think it was expected that Europe would be this poor. So we're basically one of the few countries that's accelerated in doing this quickly. And I think that has created some lopsidedness in how folks are thinking about demand.
Okay. I'm going to elaborate on Mark's next question here, but you've read, and I've read most of it, but I'm somewhat less of a PetroNerd than you are, everything there is to know about MBS. So I think it's pretty clear that he's calling all of, or at least most of the shots on everything important for the Saudis. Do you think that he has, how would you think about the pie chart of the pressure that he receives from the U.S., which now has a somewhat more dicey relationship with him after the Jamal Khashoggi report from the federal government, from within Saudi internal pressure, or from the customers?
That's also a really good question. I have so many papers that I'm struggling to find the quote I was looking for, but I think it was the Wall Street Journal that had just posted with regards to their OPEC comments. I think they had just made a comment about the Secretary of Interior making a call to Saudi Arabia and mentioning the importance of stable oil prices, but then it was clarified that they weren't talking about oil prices on the market. So, but that was an offhand thing. I think I think Mohammed bin Salman controls the market. I mean, it's very clear from if you've followed him, and I had followed him prior to when the books came out. I mean, the book MBS and the book Blood and Oil, which you've read as well. And I recently was just listening to Blood and Oil, so it's fresh in my mind. But it's very clear from those that he's definitely driving he controls most of the market. Like he literally was running in the head of Aramco, essentially. If he wanted to call the shots, he could. And that was years ago. So a lot of people, and they may not appreciate that listening to this podcast, but it's very true. So if you do your research on Mohammed bin Salman and you do the research on Saudi Arabia, this has only taken place really since his reign in the past 5 years of really this massive change in leadership and control. So it is partly why we saw that big, obviously, blow up last March with the Russians, because he was sort of in charge, and we had, Mohammed bin Salman, Putin, and Xi Jinping are extremely similar in their autocratic behaviors. And you push them too hard, and that's sort of what they do. So whether or not, how hard he's being pushed, it's real. I mean, he's also a businessman. That's why he works so well with Trump, I think. So he's definitely being pushed in the sense of they're managing the market. And I'm sure that he is directing and talking with that oil minister, really, really closely, of saying, we're going to, manage this to do the best we can. It's also really clear that how important it is to have money and to balance the budgets. He can't achieve anything he wants to. And obviously his grand 2030 vision is definitely not materializing the way he had envisioned it. But partly that's because he just doesn't have the capital to do so. So it's important for him to recover oil prices, get stability, and then be able to, they just borrowed a bunch of money at negative interest rates. So they've been able to get the capital. It's also important to think about how much they are, that VAT tax, we've mentioned it before, but it's huge. It's a 15%. Their VAT tax is 15%. They have inflation within the country, which is not good, but it did stabilize their budget completely. So yes, the people in Saudi Arabia have less money to spend stuff on, and it's all going to taxes. But the fiscal regime has actually, it's roughly half and half for oil and other revenue. Now, oil and other revenue is coming from the Saudis. So, I think it's kind of case in point of the struggles that he's in of demanding that. And that isn't going to make the people happy. But I think it's also really important in the research you've done on those books in that country. We don't know we're not hearing that, right? We should be hearing that Chinese are really happy about higher oil prices, and we should be hearing that the Saudis are not happy about a 15% VAT. But we're not going to hear that because they've completely throttled out negative criticism out of the media. So that's a reality. And so it's kind of hard to actually gauge, I think, what's actually happening within those countries in terms of how the people are feeling.
Okay, well, let's move across the Persian Gulf to Iran. We had a $400 billion deal that the New York Times originally reported on between Iran and China, which is for basically a bilateral agreement to provide oil at a lower price. I think that it clearly attacks U.S. policy of isolating Iran. What do you think the impact of that deal is on the oil market, and how do you think that influences the U.S.-Saudi relationship?
So, China and Iran have had a long-standing relationship, right? This wasn't the first, they love to ink deals. It was nice to have the photo shoot with the two guys holding their folder, the signed folders and everything. Last summer, I encourage you to Google it. There's a big New York Times article on that was a huge, several 100-page document on the potential linking. And it's significant because we've actually seen, literally by the exports of Iranian crude to China, exactly what it means for Iran and China to have a stronger relationship and how it can circumvent U.S. policy. It is a huge, it's a huge statement to the Biden administration and to basically the U.S. in general, what Iran and China just did. And the fact that, so China is importing it moves up and down, but roughly between 10 and 12 million barrels per day. And that, recently they're getting 1 million barrels a day of that. That's a good chunk of their imports. They're getting 1 million barrels a day from Iran. And it's fascinating because it's marked, those are usually marked as Omanian barrels. And so what happens is, officially, Chinese imports from Oman were 852,000 barrels a day in January, which is hilarious because technically Oman says they're only exporting over 600,000 barrels a day. the math is, it doesn't matter because it doesn't really add up. But the point is basically those barrels leave Iran, they go to a port somewhere and they kind of get moved around the water and then they end up back in China. And so the US, and the fact that we're not obviously doing a very good job, or we're not really managing that, because 1 million barrels a day is going from Iran to China. And it really is important to think about, because from a strategic alliance perspective, China is very, very serious about energy security. And that's something we talked about in one of our last podcasts on China's 5-year plan and on the emission stuff. It's really, really important to think about. All these 5-year plans, and whenever they talk about energy, security is still an element, whether they say it directly or not. But the reason they didn't increase some of those standards from an emissions standpoint is because they're very, very serious about energy security and self-sufficiency. And Iran gives them a huge leg up in that, because it's one country. They're getting all the barrels. They don't have to compete with anyone. This is not, we're getting it from Saudi, we're getting it from the US, we have to worry about, this is literally, we're getting it directly from one country. We overpay, we don't overpay, who cares? Those are our barrels. We get to help the Iranians, we get to screw over the US, and we get to show the US that look at this power that we have. And it completely circumvents Iranian sanctions. And it really puts, it doesn't put just the US, it kind of puts the world in a position that Iran no longer needs to really negotiate on these sanctions as much, because they have this massive economic windfall. 100 million barrels a day at $60 oil is pretty nice, and even if it's less than that, it's way, way more. Even if China's getting a great deal, they haven't been exporting that before, so it means a lot. And the ability for them to ramp that up, it's meaningful for China. It's great for them, from a domestic perspective, and it's great for Iran. This is a win-win, and it is not positive for the West in thinking about how these alliances work. And we know that China and Russia back Iran within, whenever it comes to UN meetings and everything. I mean, they've always had this, whether it's spoken or unspoken, and typically more spoken than not, but they always sort of back them up. And this puts the US really in a hard position with Saudi Arabia, because Saudi Arabia was not a fan of Iranian sanctions under Obama. And we still sell, we may be reducing that, but historically we've sold a lot of arms to Saudi Arabia. We had this uncomfortable relationship with them in a lot of ways. And our biggest arch rival is Iran. And the balance of power in the Middle East is still important, whether we are getting lots of crude oil from them or not, because when countries fall apart or destabilize or anything, power struggle shift and typically opens up to terrorism, and usually that bleeds over in some capacity. So it's, it has long-term ramifications.
Okay, so let's move back to the U.S. On March 25th, the American Petroleum Institute, API, came out in support of a carbon tax, which 5 years ago for me would have been like hell freezing over. It's kind of amazing. API President Mike Summers said, we're not advocating a specific price. What we are saying is that this is a framework through which API will advocate for specific principles. In contrast, U.S. Representative Garrett Graves of Louisiana, he is on the House Select Climate Committee and he's a Republican, said, we need serious American solutions that are based on American innovation, resources, and ingenuity that reduce costs and create jobs, not a cop-out approach to appease the radical left, which I think is about as succinct as you could say it. So what do you think of the API strategy here? Basically to say, yeah, we will do this if you don't single out oil and gas, and you can apply a carbon tax across the economy widely, and thinking that either gets it diluted or it's too painful to actually happen, or do they seriously want to put a $50 per ton or pick a number price on Scope 3 carbon emissions?
Well, okay, so I would say you're correct that, API is saying that 5 years ago that would have been hell freezing over. I think the reality, it does speak to the what's happening with the energy transition, what's happening with rhetoric, what's happening with investment, and the ESG momentum, everything behind this. It really does speak to that. And actually, I want to touch on, the recent IEA number showing the carbon emissions decline in 2020, and then directly correlating that to oil, and which is really what gets back to this. So the fact that API has done this, they kind of had to, right? It's literally almost like what OPEC just did. They are damned if they do, and they're damned if they don't. But having a carbon price makes it easier for everyone to just sort of work within the system. And I think from API's perspective, they're hoping that this isn't just signaling out the oil and gas industry. I would say it's not. I mean, they're well aware of what they're in DC. I mean, and they are well aware of the things that are happening within DC and probably the administration's stance on oil and gas. So I think they're hoping that this will placate to some degree folks within the administration, and they can work on getting a number that works, and that it wouldn't just be oil and gas. Because as we've talked about in previous podcasts, U.S. oil and gas production accounts for 1% of U.S. Carbon emissions. So the actual production from this, if that's why you're going at it from carbon emissions standpoint, you're not going to get it. However, that being said, it's obviously a huge deal. I mean, I listen to these podcasts, you do too. I mean, I follow this, that methane emissions are huge, and all these things are components which the industry is working on. And we're hearing, Diamondback and others, buying carbon offset, buying credits. Hell freezing over is the same thing of hearing scope 1 and scope 2 emissions in a U.S. independent earnings call. I mean, you wouldn't have expected to hear that stuff, a couple of years ago. So I think it's the same thing. I don't think it's, what everyone would have liked. And I think quite candidly, if you were to pull these oil and gas, executives into a room and ask them off the record what they thought of this stuff, I'd be honest, I don't think a lot of them are probably buy into it. They're doing this because this is the world that they have to live into. And I think that's, if you get to the right number, I guess the concern would be that how do you get to that right number? And obviously for the oil industry, they're going to want it lower than, the agenda. If you're on the very, really pushing on the accelerated energy transition, which says, we have to really get away from fossil fuels immediately, because there's a huge fear that if we don't, if we use them in interim, then we'll get stuck using them and then we'll never sort of get off of them. And that I think would be instigating and pressure for the administration maybe to have to push that carbon tax up enough that it disincentivizes all this stuff. And the point of the carbon tax is that it disincentivizes, actual carbon output, right? And so there's a problem in that the way carbon taxes have been used to date is they haven't exactly incentivized that. They sort of pay and you're paying for offset emissions. But, I think about this in a lot of ways of these, a lot of folks are, when Jason Bordoff is talking to BP and Spencer Dale in his podcast and at Columbia, and he's talking to him about all the stuff they're doing to green their footprint and how they're going, net zero and it's BP green and all this stuff. BP has also sold a lot of their assets. So a lot of these companies literally are just selling their oily assets to another company who probably doesn't have the same standards that they do. And the oil is still going to get produced and just by maybe a Chinese or a Russian company. So they're really not doing anything other than making their footprint a little greener and hoping that that's going to, increase their share price performance or basically increase their longevity in the space. So I wouldn't say this is the same thing. I just think it's really complex and we probably will not see, intense agreement. It's a step in the right direction from getting the far right on, getting the oil side and I think the administration are probably closer together, but we have to see some give and take, I think, and we'll see if that works out. I don't know the exact number I'm not an expert on that. I don't know what that exact number to be. I would love to have an expert on carbon tax and climate change on this podcast. Welcome them on here. We can talk about it all day long, but it is just, it's a really complex issue and I don't think it's going to be solved overnight.
Well, that is a good segue into the last topic I want to address, which is an IEA meeting where the focus was net zero by 2060. And most of the demand we see for energy is coming from Asia going forward. In particular, China and India are the focus. And at that meeting, Raj Kumar Singh, who is the power minister for India, said 2060 sounds good, but it is just that. It sounds good. I would call it, and I'm sorry to say this, but it's just pie in the sky. He went on to say, what we hear is that by 2050 or 2060, we will become carbon neutral. 2060 is far away, and if the people emit at the rate they are emitting, the world won't survive. So what are you going to do in the next 5 years? That's what the world wants you to know. And he's talking specifically about OECD emissions and the developed world, which has per capita emissions at 10 or 12 times the rate of developing economies, particularly India. My view is that India and China will continue to focus on what you said earlier, which is energy security. The Chinese are building more coal plants and won't have peak emissions anytime soon. It's actually, to the U.S. natural gas industry credit, U.S. emissions in oil and gas may actually have peaked and are coming down because coal usage is down, which of course may reverse if federal lands or other bans on U.S. production shift us back to more coal. But is there any, in your mind, is there any reasonable expectation that China and India will take a lower carbon path in the near term? And can the OECD countries stomach the pain from the sort of reductions that would be required in per capita emissions that have resulted in things like the yellow bus protests in France?
I think it's pretty easily the answer is no. And we have to be careful with that, because I think that I do want, folks outside the industry to listen to this. And this is something I've been researching lately. And I think it's really important of that, one, understanding what the energy transition is, two, understanding why, this accelerated energy transition that we're talking about, and really how China and India fit into this. So if you're straight up asking the question, is China and India are they, either of them, going to reduce their emissions in the near term in the next 5 years? The only reason either of them would do that, if their economy slows and they literally use less, that would be why. Or it's in their benefit from an economic perspective and energy security perspective to have so much renewables that it would offset some of that. Neither of them are in the position to actually reduce that. We know from China's 5-year plan that they do not plan on they have some caps that are not binding, but they do not plan on reducing emissions in the near term, not even next 5 years, but even they're refusing to set an actual emissions target. And that's where they're getting criticism from a lot of people. Like, you just said we're going to be neutral in 2060, and it means absolute nothing. It is not. In theory, it could happen, but you would have to have so much coal. You would have to have so much carbon capture on those coal plants. And so you can go to this is all publicly available information. You can Google all the coal-fired power plants in China, all of them in India. It's really important, the age of these coal-fired power plants. They're very, very young. We're talking about the bulk of them being 5 to 10 years old. They're going to run these for 20 years. And even if they pulled them off online, the real thing people have to realize is that China and India have coal. They produce it. We have oil and gas. The reason our emissions in the US we are the third largest emitter, and we emit a lot, but we're about 5,000, I think it's 5,000 million tons of oil equivalent, or the MT tons. This is the BP data. It's 5,000, right? China, this is 2019. China is above 10,000 in 2019. They've increased. Everybody else has sort of decreased. The US led that. We are at 1992 levels as of 2019, and that's because our actual, coal consumption went down in the power sector and gas consumption went up. That's simply it. And because we have a lot of shale gas.
A little credit to renewables too.
Absolutely.
Some slice of that.
Absolutely.
Let's give due credit there.
I'm going to get to that because I have the data on the power breakdown for all this, and you can literally look at BP and other sources. IEA has it too. What's the power breakdown by sector for all these places? And when you want to look at the biggest emitters, you should pull up the breakdown of power, and you can see that China is 65% coal. And the reason they're 65% coal is because they produce all that coal, so they don't import it. And you should ask the question, well, and this came up in last night's Clubhouse discussion. What's the outlook for gas? I'm relatively bullish on the outlook for gas in terms of, steady growth, not massive growth, but India consuming more, because India has imported natural gas. China has about a 30 BCF a day gas market. They import about 15 BCF a day. We export right now over 11 BCF a day. So their import market, and the fact that hasn't risen, China has built out all these coal plants. If they wanted to build out gas, they could have, but they chose not to. And the reason they chose not to is because they have the coal, and that would be silly from an energy security perspective. So when you look at that, when they're having that meeting, and I think it's really, really important to realize this, because everybody is throwing out these numbers, right? They're saying we have to hit these targets. And particularly within oil and gas, they're saying, we have to decline. The International Energy Agency, as we spoke in the last podcast, is saying we have to decline massively in the next 5 years and 10 years to really reduce these emissions. They don't put a number, an absolute carbon output number, on what it looks like to hit those. It's their 1.5 and 2 degree or sustainable targets or whatever they are. We don't know what the actual carbon number is. So tell us what the total number of carbon is now, and tell us, if we reduce demand down to almost, half it in 10 years, where is the carbon output? And I don't know, and maybe somebody can get on the podcast, somebody can send the data, but it bothers me a little bit that we don't see actual carbon numbers attached to these reductions. And we also don't see forecasts for reducing demand of coal in India and China. In fact, the IEA and everyone else keeps it flat. They keep it basically static, maybe declining a little. So they're advocating and pushing for massive reduction in oil because that's what happened during COVID. They saw what could happen, and I have this chart in front of me. Emissions dropped by several, a decent amount, a chunk, and yet in all the countries it dropped everywhere, largely in the U.S. with gasoline consumption and transportation. So basically, this was what the world could look like is if we shut down like this. That's pretty scary, is that your forecasts are based upon when we shut the world entirely in. So the reality is it's not going to happen, and you're not going to, at least the American people don't want to be shut in again, and they will continue to drive the trucks and SUVs as they are. So that is just a fact of life. And whether or not you want to put that in your forecast or not, some companies like Boston Consulting Group and others, they're baking that into their forecast. The problem is China actually increased. During COVID, they were one of the only countries that actually increased their emissions. And it was by a decent amount. I think it was by like some 9%. 9% overall, about 90 million tons of CO2. So it wasn't a small amount because their economic activity grew. And the share, so when IEA actually put out a chart as well, and they put the share of basically from 2000 to 2020. And it's basically just the share coal consumption and what it looks like. And so you can just see the rest of the world, China, all these countries. China from 2000 to was about a quarter of the pie, and now they are over half the pie. So in 20 years, they now have over half the coal consumption. So it's really about like what's driving the growth in the CO2 emissions is that it's that coal consumption. And it's really important because the reason, and I'm not positive on this, and people can correct me, I can be wrong, but it seems to me oil gets unfairly attacked by CO2 emission reductions because it's easier to abate because we have this technology, we have electric vehicles that if you just push it in the market, we can drive down oil consumption. But guess what? If you're plugging it in with coal, which is what it's done in China, and you can pull this up on Bloomberg, you can pull it up on Bloomberg. There's a really good chart that shows you electric vehicles, how clean they are. And in China, they are dirtier than the US, dirtier than making an internal combustion engine car in the US because they don't have the environmental standards. And they're pretty dirty to actually plug in because 65% of the power is coming from coal. So you got to ask yourself, why do they do that? If it's not about coal, and then, to some degree, they've reduced the emissions and they want to clean up, and they're cleaning up the smog in the cities with those electric vehicles. But that tells you two things. It tells you that China really cares about domestic supply of coal, and that bringing in increased EVs helps them reduce their reliance and increasing reliance on crude oil. And those are two very beneficial things. For India doesn't emit nearly as much as we do, or as the US does, or as China does. So they're pretty pissed at this. I mean, I think they're pretty angry that, yes, their emissions are increasing. But I mean, we're talking from a power sector standpoint, they're a fraction of what the US, they're basically closer to what the US is. And they produce a lot of coal and they consume a lot of coal. They are actually trying, though. They increase a lot of natural gas and they're trying to do this. But I think the reality is, and we talked about this on some previous podcasts, but when I've researched it, it is so complex in India. I mean, it is just entrenched and embedded into their economy, and it's going to be really hard to abate in the near term. I'm not saying India has the opportunities. One, they just don't emit nearly as much. They're the third largest emitter. So I think 5 years from now, it's going to, within those 5 years, it's harder. But looking out, they're going to increase their natural gas consumption. So I think we could see them reduce that. But honest to God, it is really important that if you want to reduce emissions in the near term, you want to push as much natural gas into the Asian economies as possible into the power sector. That is the way to reduce emissions super fast, because that's where the growth in emissions is coming from. And that's the story. So you can work on pushing, more renewables into the grid in the US. That's great. That's fine. Push more renewables into, Europe. That's already happening. But really, if you want to see the changes in those numbers, I mean, people are, the IEA is forecasting that we're going to see all the change by dramatically reducing, driving, or oil consumption in the US and all these places. That's not what this is all. It's not all about oil consumption. It has a lot to do with coal consumption, and that's just a reality. And the reason it's important to look at those information and the data is it has serious implications for gas demand, has serious implications for gas markets, has serious implications for what happens when, you and I both saw the article on The Economist article on the big boom in mining and the fact that we're going to be short lithium within, years, and there isn't even enough supply to sort of come back. I think if prices go up enough, everybody's going to mine for it and you'll find it. But it's not, a lot of it's not here. We're not going to mine for it here. And the reality is we could see increase in emissions with a mining boom. I mean, we're going to mine for it in China. We're going to mine for it in India. We're going to mine everywhere. And this is just, no energy is free from energy. It takes energy to produce other energy. And I just think it's, when you're looking at the numbers and you're doing the math on this, it's not super easy. And thinking that we're just going to reduce, if we reduce gas consumption and, and oil consumption in the US and Europe, that we're going to solve this problem. I don't think it's going to work. And correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't India basically say they wanted to see negative emissions from the OECD? Wasn't that kind of the point?
Very, very much so. That's their position.
Yeah. So that would be, and they're basically, I think that's they're just pushing back and saying, okay, well, if you want us to decline, because that would mean that their economic growth forecast would probably change. That would mean that they would have to spend a ton of money on their grid in the near term, all this infrastructure, and build out. And that really does reduce their energy security. China is definitely not going to do it. They are literally just going to use coal and keep building out what they have. And if they do reduce emissions, it's just a net benefit. It's more of a net benefit to them. But it's going to be increasingly complex because then you're asking the developed world, you're asking the OECD to drastically decline your economic outlook. And be negative, we're already reducing our emissions. If you look at oil demand in Europe, it's been declining for years. It continues to decline. So all these emissions are coming, and then they have drastic plans, to continue to change their economies and do this. So that's already happening. So to go negative rapidly would mean to go negative or at least rapidly decline your economies as well. And I don't think that's likely. It's certainly not likely in the term. And it's setting the US up. It's setting the globe up for kind of a bifurcated world in which, as far as I understand, CO2 emissions do not have borders. So this is not going, this is a coordinated effort if this is what it's about. And it's going to become very, very complex and messy. And it has just massive implications for investment decisions and patterns, especially on oil and gas and coal and everything else.
Well, it's unlikely to be boring in the next few years. And I think we've reached a natural stopping point. So with that, I want to thank you, my lovely co-host, Trish Curtis. Thank you so much, as well as the McClellan family, Colin and Julie, and Jacob Corley for hosting us on the Digital Wildcatters platform. With that, we will wrap up episode 9, and the next one will be number 10, which is a nice little milestone. Trisha, thank you. It's been a pleasure.
It has been an absolute pleasure. And Leslie, I was actually on the Oil and Gas Startups podcast. I'm pretty proud of that because it took me a long time to get on that. So if you haven't listened to it, that's Jake and Colin's main podcast. It was super fun. We'll get Ethan on there someday soon. Thank you very much, Ethan. It was a blast, and I appreciate it.
Okay, we'll see you next time, folks.
Bye.